The ethical dimension of Barbie Q. In a story that depends so heavily on the relation between the implied authors and the narrator's perspectives, it is not surprising that the most important ethical position is the third one, that of the implied author in relation to the narrator and the audience. But the first two positions also matter. With regard to the first, there are two main situations, that of the girls in relation to each other, and that of the girls in relation to the messages of corporate capitalism and mainstream culture. The relationship between the girls is not greatly developed, but what we see is admirable. They play together with pleasure, and they successfully collaborate in the acquisition of the new dolls. Indeed, this aspect of the relationship is another reason we sympathize with the character narrator. We have already touched on the ways that the messages of mainstream culture are ethically deficient, though I want to note here that this deficiency is not dramatized but assumed in the story as Cisneros focuses on the girl's response to her situation. The most unusual position in the story is the narrator's relation to her audience throughout the redundant telling. In telling her sister what she already knows, the character narrator is violating what H.P. Grice has called the cooperative principle of conversation, which says that one should make one's contribution relevant and appropriate to the situation. More particularly, the character narrator is violating the maxim of quantity, which stipulates that one should not tell someone something that he or she already knows. Such violations have the potential to mark the speaker as not just inattentive or socially inept, but also self-centered. In this case, however, because the effects of the redundant telling are to foreground the synthetic component of the narrative and to signal Cisneros' greater concern with the thematic purposes of the narrative, those ethical consequences don't occur. Instead, the effect of the redundant telling is to transfer even greater ethical weight to the third ethical situation, the relations among Cisneros, the character narrator, and the authorial audience. One key to these relations is the lyric progression, the kinds of emotional responses it elicits, and the kinds of judgments Cisneros asks us to make within it. I have noted the importance of our response to the girls' excitement at seeing the Barbie dolls and the way it increases our desire for them to attain their desires. With respect to judgments, it's striking that Cisneros does not ask us to judge specific actions. For example, we do not come away convinced that the character narrator's relentless repetition of please means that she is a whiny child, but Cisneros does ask us to see the narration as unreliable in the sense that the character narrator partially misreads and partially misjudges her situation. In this sense, Cisneros positions herself and her audience above the character narrator, looking down on her with superior knowledge and understanding. The ethical risk of such a position is condescension toward the character narrator and even toward our emotional response toward her and her situation. We may end up comfortably reinforced in our superiority, pitying the poor girl who really does not understand what is happening to her and shaking our heads about our own willingness to be taken in by her hopeless desires. If Cisneros had written the politically correct version of the story, then she would have invited this kind of condescension from her audience. But the actual story is more ethically challenging because our superior understanding of the character's narrator situation is accompanied by three other elements of our response. One, our sustained emotional investment in her desire. Two, our recognition of Cisneros' departure from stereotyped treatments. And three, our positive judgments of some aspects of the character narrator's response to her situation. Throughout the story, Cisneros invokes stereotypes that initially seem to apply to the situation only to show that they are inadequate. The girls are interested in Barbie dolls, but not in Ken, who is initially invisible. They are interested in Barbie's fashions, but not her body. The character narrator is susceptible to the messages of dominant culture, but she is not defined by them. By working this way, the story exposes the limits of stereotype-based or cultural narrative-based thinking about the character narrator. As she does this exposing, Cisneros does not condescend to the character narrator and does not ask the audience to turn on its own emotional investment, but instead guides us to share her respect for the girl. Consequently, flesh and blood readers, or at least the flesh and blood reader, respond to Cisneros with similar respect. In this way, the story provides an ethically satisfying reading experience. Redundant telling and the impulse to preserve the mimetic. In discussing both My Last Duchess and Barbecue with other readers, I have found that many want to propose alternative explanations of what I have called their redundant telling. Explanations that seek to preserve the mimetic component of the story by finding a plausible, naturalistic rationale for the narration. I believe that these alternatives are very revealing because they point to readers' default assumptions about the relation between character functions and narrator functions, and about the power of those assumptions to affect our interpretations. With My Last Duchess, the alternative explanation is that the Duke's reference to the Count Your Master is motivated by the Duke's interest in reminding the envoy of the significant power differential between them, thereby putting the envoy back in his place after the more deferential treatment of him during the display of the portrait. While this account is sensible, it is also very general. The Duke's interest in exercising his power can be invoked to explain every line of the poem, but such an invocation does not give us a very precise account of Browning's craft in each line. Furthermore, upon closer inspection, the account gives us a different kind of redundancy in the Duke, since the story he has just told the envoy about the fate of his last Duchess is all about his audacious exercise of his power. The envoy would have to be extremely dense not to be keenly aware of the place in which he has already been put. For these reasons, I believe that the more persuasive account of the line is that it is an instance of redundant telling. At the same time, our default interest in preserving the mimetic means that we are very likely not only to not notice the redundancy on a first reading, but also to try to explain it away when it is pointed out. With Barbecue, there are three main ways to counter the explanation that Cisneros is employing redundant narration, and there are variations on each of the last two ways. 1. To read the narrator and the narratee as the same character. That is, to understand the narrator's monologue as addressed not to a playmate or a sister, but to herself, perhaps in the guise of an imaginary friend. 2. To define a specific occasion for the narration that makes it mimetically plausible. And 3. To find a specific rhetorical purpose for the narrator's telling the story to the narratee. Each of these hypotheses, however, either encounters some significant recalcitrance from the text itself, or is grounded less in the details of the text than in the conviction that there must be a mimetic explanation for the telling. By the way, the mimetic explanation would be also a proiretic explanation. Just wanted to point that out. In relation to this last point, it will be helpful to consider briefly the difference between Browning's communication about the occasion and motive for the Duke's telling, and Cisneros' communication about these matters in Barbecue. Understanding that the Duke is speaking to the emissary from the father of his next bride shortly before the marriage in order to deliver a warning without seeming to stoop, such an understanding is what I call a necessary inference, since the force of the poem depends crucially upon it. Furthermore, Browning supplies all the relevant clues to the occasion, most of them in lines 49 through 51. The Count Your Master's known munificence is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed. But some, and other lines such as, we'll meet the company below then, Cisneros includes no similar clues to the occasion and motive of her character narrator's monologue, and consequently there is no necessary inference about them analogous to the one in My Last Duchess. Consequently, we are left either to supply these matters or to see the first 5 paragraphs as redundant telling. Experienced readers are of course, very good at supplying mimetic justifications, but my argument is that A, without any clear guidance from Cisneros, any one justification is as good or bad as any other, and thus B, the hypothesis about redundant telling is more compelling. Furthermore, C, the mimetic justifications are unnecessary because the conventions of character narration, particularly the principle that disclosure functions will trump narrator functions, allow for the redundant telling to foreground the synthetic and thematic components of the story without eliminating its mimetic interest. But let's look more closely at the mimetic justifications. With respect to the hypothesis that the narrator and the narratee are the same person, the recalcitrance includes the opening sharp split between yours and mine and their respective possessions, a split that is reinforced by the subsequent references to what we'd both rather have and to our one outfit apiece. The recalcitrance also includes the narrator's remark that directs the gaze of the narratee to the toy warehouse on Halstead Street. See there! These recalcitrant details can be accounted for with the variation of this hypothesis that the character narrator is addressing an imaginary friend. But there is nothing in the story that decisively marks the friend as imaginary, and so the move to the variation seems motivated less by textual details than by the need to preserve the mimetic. Furthermore, seeing the character narrator as addressing herself weakens the thematic force of the story because it locates the desire for Barbie and what she represents in a single character, whereas seeing the narratee as a distinct real person expands the horizon of desire. One can also attempt to preserve the mimetic by specifying the occasion of narration as a time much later than the events reported when the narrator wants to reminisce with the narratee. A related move is to see the shared remembrance as itself something that repeats. This is not the first time that narrator and narratee have gotten together and shared this story. Once again, however, this hypothesis encounters a significant recalcitrance. As noted above, the diction of the story marks the narrator as a pre-adolescent, and the shift from the historical present of the first 5 paragraphs to the simultaneous present of the last, who's to know, indicates that the narration occurs shortly after the events reported. A variation on this hypothesis admits the redundancy, but sees it as part and parcel of the girls' pleasurable sharing of their common experience, a conversion of that experience into narrative. This variation is initially appealing until we realize that it leaps over the story's silence about the narratee's response, and that it deals much more satisfactorily with the story's first 5 paragraphs than with its concluding 6th. The hypothesis that the narrator is trying to persuade the narratee to view the dolls in the same way that she does has the advantage of giving a motivated progression to the narrator's discourse. All strokes lead to the argument that they can do just fine with the barbecued Barbies. The problem with this hypothesis, however, is the disjunction between the apparent naivete of the character and the sophisticated rhetorical purpose attributed to the narrator. In other words, the impulse to preserve the mimetic is not successful on mimetic grounds. Apart from the specifics of these approaches, I am struck by the power of the interpretive habit to preserve the mimetic. That power is not at all surprising. The mimetic component of narrative is responsible for our emotional responses to it, and those responses are a crucial part of the distinctive quality and power of narrative. Furthermore, the impulse to preserve the mimetic also contributes to the effectiveness of a poem such as My Last Duchess, by contributing to our willingness to gloss over the redundant telling. The impulse also suggests 2 other related conclusions. 1. In reading character narration, we regard the character functions as more prominent than the narrator functions. We are inclined to explain away redundant telling and other examples of disclosure functions trumping narrator functions because we think that such narrative situations will detract from the mimetic function of the character. But my point is that, 2, violations of strict mimesis in the narrator functions Or to put it another way, narrator functions and techniques that depend on the narrator's synthetic rather than mimetic status can be introduced without entirely breaking the mimetic illusion, provided that they enhance a story's overall purpose and effect. In Barbecue, Cisneros' use of redundant telling exposes the fault line between the I's, character functions, and the narrator functions. But it does not overpower the story's mimetic component. Instead, the redundant telling makes possible the authorial audience's simultaneous understanding of events and the character narrator's perspective on those events, and in so doing, provides the basis of our emotional response to her. The response upon which Cisneros builds the thematic component of the story In sum, it is not possible to account adequately for the redundant telling as a mimetic strategy, but that impossibility is a sign not of Cisneros' flawed construction, but of her ingenuity.